Alright, so in this fifth part we're taking a look at the Bronze Age and how it basically affects our village that we have here. In the previous parts we took a look at how our small village had started as a Paleolithic settlement with maybe about 20-30 people. And now by this point has grown to a pretty good sized town of about 200 individuals. This is the era known as the Bronze Age, and so we'll talk about essentially what the Bronze Age means. It's a time period in which bronze becomes the dominant metal that people are typically using, well, alloy. And we'll talk about what bronze is, why it's significant, and really how our village has changed as a result. There's some pretty large changes that take place during the Bronze Age, which typically lasts from about 3200 BCE all the way to about 1200 BCE. So first of all, obviously same village, but obviously it has suffered some, well, I wouldn't say suffered, it has increased its technological capabilities significantly through the creation of new metals and opportunities. First of all, this of course involves the smelting of bronze, which is what we get this time period's name from. Now, bronze itself is basically a combination of two metals, that of copper and that of tin. People would mine them, right? They would bring them together, and then as we mentioned before in the Copper Age, right, they would use charcoal to be able to create a fire that was hot enough. And once they achieved that, right, then they could basically begin to smelt what was known as an alloy. Alloy is a combination of two metals that has some of the best elements of both. Remember, as we discussed, the problem with having copper was that it simply was too flimsy to be used on a large scale. This guy you can see here is wielding a bronze spear, right? You can see it's nice, brilliant orange color, right? But basically, the typical element of bronze is that it combines both copper and tin. And basically, this was important because tin tended to be too brittle, and copper tended to be too malleable. So if you add them together, then you get something that's just right. And that's typically what happens in the Bronze Age. They kind of found the best of both worlds in this alloy. And so bronze was definitely superior to copper. And so hopefully somebody will bring some bronze in, or some bronze in here in a second, and we can show you how the smelting process takes place. But ultimately, while we're waiting for that, let's take a look at some of the other improvements of the village. First of all, you can see here we've got, unfortunately, another death. But the thing successful coming out of this is, of course, Mr. Horse. Right, so obviously horses have been domesticated by this time of the Bronze Age. People are using them not only to pull carts, but also to pull plows, which also are invented during this era. And so we'll get an opportunity basically to take a look at the significance of the horse as a beast of burden, similar to the donkey, but certainly horses were bigger, more powerful. They could also be used in war, so they could pull chariots. They were also significant in that you could eventually ride them into battle as we get more into the Iron Age. But yeah, that's one of the big differences, is of course bringing in horses into the settlement, and that's certainly going to help out significantly in a variety of ways. Now, other aspects of the community that have changed as a result of the Bronze Age. Ultimately, we've got some examples of the workshop over here where people are going to be building a variety of different things, from plows to sledges to fishing gear, and also the composite bow, which has made its arrangement in this era. Another thing, of course, you can see here is this woman here has a fishing trap. This was far more successful than previous ways of fishing, rod and tackle, for example, or just using a harpoon, for example, in the older Paleolithic era. And so people have become more efficient at being able to catch fish, and certainly more fish means that we can support a higher population. Other aspects of this era that are significant, as far as the plow is concerned, we'll see if we get to see a harvest take place or some plowing. If that happens, then I'll basically show you that. But ultimately, yeah, agriculture is going to become more significant. Obviously, with beasts of burden pulling the plow, they're going to be able to haul and ultimately plow up land much faster than what you would typically have with just humans going out there poking the dirt with sticks. or hoeing the ground. And so all of that's going to be important to increasing the productivity of the settlements as well. We also begin to see these kinds of statues, carvings, that become more prevalent during the Bronze Age, particularly of important gods. Stables in this era have been redone essentially to include thatching and stone, so that they are essentially better. They keep heat in much better than previous structures that were made of daub. And so because of that, you can support more animals, and the animals that are there are going to be supported in better comfort. This is also true of the houses. So you can see, for example, that this is an example of one of the houses that's known as a roundhouse. These were typically identified by archaeologists in what were called stone, or not basically stone, but what were called housing circles, which they find throughout northern Europe. And basically they were circular style houses. They had a stone laid out in the foundation at the bottom. And they got a horse just running around there. Right, spirit is free. I'm gonna ride, I'm riding free. So come along, let's go along, come on, let's journey with me. Right, and so yeah, they basically had stone that was laid as the foundation, and then typically you would have a thatching in the roof. And so these were much more permanent structures. They were much better than the previous huts that had been assembled. And so this obviously allowed for substantial populations. Some of these roundhouses were huge, and they could support an entire family of people, as evidenced in England and Wales. And so this is how structures have become substantially better as a result of this era. Here we've got an individual who is smelting some bronze, right? So basically you take 3 parts copper to 1 part tin. Right, you add some charcoal to get the fire not nice and hot. You can see obviously he has to blow into it in order to increase the oxygen so that he can get the fire hotter, and that will ultimately be responsible for trying to create a better quality metal. Typically the hotter the fire, the more impurities you can get out of it, and the better the mixture that you would get. And so this is what's known as a pit furnace. And basically it is made out of clay, and this is basically how they would probably smelt most of their bronze in the village. And so this was an important structure, and it was obviously how people would get the right metal combinations they would need. Now obviously once the bronze had been created, then it could be created and turned into a variety of things. This guy here is making a shield, which is basically going to be important for defense. So it's during this era that we start to see weapons like the sword, shields, etc. That begin to be produced for protective purposes. We also begin to see armors that start to appear as well, typically leather kinds of armor or bronze armor for the really wealthy, but typically we begin to see these nonetheless. And so we're starting to see protective gear, we're starting to see the martial prowess of the village on display. As far as other aspects of what we see in the village as a result of the Bronze Age, right? Storage facilities that are much more robust, that can basically withstand greater punishment. Obviously, much like with the roundhouses, with that stone structure added into them, it certainly makes the dwellings more compact, right? And here you can see some of the older Neolithic structures that are nearby, just to kind of give you some effect, so you can see how they've changed as far as their materials. Other aspects of the village that are important as far as the Bronze Age is concerned is this is a time period in which we also see beer making that basically begins to surface. So as the society begins to produce more and more grain, right, one of the ways in which they could process the excess grain was to create beer. And it's probably during the Bronze Age that we begin to see, or even the Copper Age, the first beer that is produced. And it was basically produced in these large vats that you can see up here, where they would combine barley and various other grains together, right? And then, I guess he's just going to leave it there, right? Interesting. But they would basically put the beer in a large vat. You can see here they would brew large amounts of it at a time, right? They would heat it to basically get the various elements together, and then what they would have produced would have been a very grainy, high alcohol kind of beer. Certainly an acquired taste for those of us that are familiar with American beers today, like Budweiser and Bud Light. If you like that, this beer is for lack of a better word, what my uncle would always say, it's going to put hair on your chest. It's a pretty high alcohol content kind of thing. So yeah, as far as beer production, this was done, of course, for the village during this period as well. And the good thing about beer is that beer probably saved untold lives, because remember, people are drinking straight out of the river, and who knows what diseases the village upriver of you has, and of course people's waste is going straight into it. So as far as beer, at least it goes through a heating process, and with the alcohol in it, because of that filtration, you're probably getting some of those impurities out. So it probably was safer to drink the beer than it was to drink the water during this period. Here you can see next to it, this is an outfitter where somebody is taking various kinds of cloth and putting them together to make garments, tunics, obviously winter wear, etc. And these are things that would be important for the entire village because people got to wear clothes, especially here in Northern Europe. Certainly it's going to get cold, and so you want to be able to survive in a somewhat hostile climate. Other aspects, here you can see a harvest taking place. Obviously in the summertime, people would harvest various kinds of beans, and so people would go out with sickles and they would go out and pick the various kinds of beans and harvest as necessary. This would typically be something that most of the village would participate in, and there would be harvest ceremonies that would take place at the conclusion of these to celebrate, the fortune of the village, because the harvest was such an important time for everybody involved. And here you can see, of course, people in the village taking a part of that. As far as other parts of the Bronze Age, I think we covered most of the major aspects. Obviously, fruit trees become domesticated in the Copper Age, and so we begin to see people growing various kinds of fruits, whether they be pears, chestnuts, and other cherries and others. And those, of course, could be a way to supplement their income in dry times as well. So as far as other elements of the Bronze Age, I think it pretty much covers most of it. What we'll take a look at in the next era is we'll basically discover the nature of the Iron Age. Oh, there's a plow. Right, I wanted to show you all a plow. Right. So yeah, essentially the plow, this is an important structure because what the plow does is it allows you to be able to plow large amounts of farmland in a short period of time. And with a beast of burden such as a horse hooked up to it, it's certainly going to run much more efficiently than humans trying to poke the ground. So I did want to find a plow, and I did find one for you guys, so that's good. But yeah, back to my earlier train of thought, we're taking a look at the next era, which is going to move on, and we'll take a look at the Iron Age. And how the settlement has ultimately changed. There'll be some cosmetic changes, obviously metallurgically there'll be changes, and we'll take a look at how the structures will be updated as a result.